Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
So all these small things that we as U.S. citizens do not even see because they're always there are not there because they're in the air. They're there for really important reasons, and if we want to protect those little miracles, and if we want this democracy to go on surviving and becoming better, then we need to recognize them, because democracy isn't just about elections. It's about so much more.
Hello, and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 86, where we are definitely not 86ing ourselves. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Roya Hakakian about her book, A Beginner's Guide to America, for the Immigrant and the Curious. Roya Hakakian is the author of 2 books of poetry in Persian and numerous essays and articles in leading publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and NPR. She is a founding member of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. She is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for Nonfiction for her book, Assassins of the Turquoise Palace. Her memoir, Journey from the Land of No, about coming of age as a Jewish girl in post-revolutionary Iran, received Elle Magazine's Reader's Choice Award. Her latest book is called A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. Very excited to be joined today by author Roya Hakakian, author of A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. Roya, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, John. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks. It's so exciting to have you. This is just such an interesting book and has a lot of different nuances to it than I think a lot of readers will be familiar with in terms of the way that they think about books even and why they might read them. So to start to unravel all of that, why don't we just kick it off? And I'd love to hear kind of in your own words what this book is all about.
Yesterday I wrote a couple of lines to a friend that I think are sort of capture what it is that I want to say in answer to your question, which was, for the longest time, especially since 2016, I heard an earful from policymakers, from journalists, from people on the radio, people on the television about immigration and who immigrants are,
Mm-hmm.
whether people who were pro or against. And it occurred to me that um, that why not give an opportunity to the immigrant to then have their say about how they see America and Americans. And I thought, it would be nice to kind of turn the tables, rather than have everybody else talk about immigrants, have immigrants talk about America and Americans, and in a very surprising way, I recognized as soon as I started thinking about this that that it was as if I had been taking notes ever since I came to this country, and so many things were already readily available to my memory, to my consciousness. So I just thought, you know, um, we should have a say too as immigrants, and we should reflect on what we see here and how everybody else and everything else sounds and seen to us.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
it's sort of America from uh, an immigrant's perspective.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And I thought, because um, it is always everybody else commenting on immigrants and
Hmm.
immigration. And I thought, well, immigrants have things to say too. So, so
Yeah,
I thought,
they sure do.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and on top of that, you've done a lot of other creative work. Before this book, this wasn't kind of your first time doing all of this. You've done books of poetry, essays, you've been in film and television. You've kind of done all this other stuff here. So I'm just curious to know, like, how does this work fit in to all of that? Is this a big departure from work you've done before? Is this kind of connected to themes that you've been thinking about, or how does all your other creative energy kind of connect with this work?
It's a wonderful question you're asking, because I think about that myself. Um, because as human beings, we like to think, oh, I'm not a scatterbrain. Everything I do is for purpose, and I'm moving in a very thoughtful direction, and we want to think that we're willful about things, and so I ask this of myself. How does this fit in with everything else I've done? And the answer, I suppose, is that um, I think whether I've done poetry or television work, documentaries, news, essays, and the previous two books, I think that I'm always in one of the positions that I know well.
Hmm.
In other words, as in my first book was a memoir, so I was the younger me, um, and I knew I was trying to recapture what that young girl had seen of a major historical transformation. Um, my second book was about an assassination, a true story, the true story of an assassination that took place in Germany in 1992, and there too, I think I was observing in my capacity as a person in exile, because the people who had been the victims of the assassination had also been Iranians, as
Hmm.
I am, and they had um, come into the crosshairs with the Iranian government, and um, finally fell victim to their attacks. And so I think I understood that too. So a side of me, obviously, lives outside of Iran, is an exile, and so it was not far fetched for me to try to capture to try to capture some aspect of that experience. And this time around in this book, I am in my capacity as a refugee and an immigrant, and so I think it is it is that whatever I have done, I have tried to look at a picture through a piece of me that has had some of that experience already.
Yeah, yeah. Write what you know.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then try to make it slightly more expansive than you already know.
yeah, yeah, and I think you use an interesting kind of rhetorical trick in the book to to force people to experience this work in a different way than most
Yeah.
books, which is you use the second person
Mhm.
and the word you is possibly the most used word in the book if you had to do a word count maybe, and that's because you're challenging people every single setting that you're putting your character, your protagonist in as that's the reader. You're saying, you're looking at this and seeing these things. Now you're over here and you're seeing that. And so, I thought that was a really interesting decision that is quite rare. Um, so I just was wondering how you decided to do that as opposed to just more abstractly talking about experiences or putting or just think or talking or using I to talk about how you saw things or some other way of doing it.
I really love the way you put that, uh, because that's precisely how I have been trying to explain why I did what I did. Um, it, it- well, here's what I saw in 2016 when uh, the presidential elections in America went, in a way that so many of us didn't expect, and the anti-immigrant rhetoric reached a new high.
Hmm.
And I began reading a series of things, whether they were journalistic reporting or books about immigrants and immigration, that seemed to do exactly what you described. They were either in first person, personal experiences, or they were sort of these, godlike voices of reporters uh, talking about what, their own observations or whatever it was that was going on. And I thought um, that I wanted to do more. I wanted
Hmm.
somebody to come really close to to what the immigrant sees, feels, um, experiences, especially in those initial years. And I thought, if I did first person, then the book would be chalked up as a memoir, and it would be just one immigrant, and that's not what I wanted to do.
Hmm.
And if I were to do sort of the third person journalistic prose, then it would I would sound like all these other um, articles that were being written in newspapers and everything else. And so I had to strike some other tone through some other voice, so that the reader would be jarred out of his or her own position of comfort, and that I have no trouble thinking that this book makes sounds odd, or does odd things. I think it's okay to pick something up and say, this isn't doing what I thought it was going to do, as long as I don't lose the reader along the way. I think creating, just a slight bit of a sense of uh, dislocation, so that somebody begins to pay attention to something a little differently. I was fine with that. I wanted that. I wanted people to read and pay attention in a way that they wouldn't do, with the other two voices, or literature.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think that's exactly the kind of reason you would want for making that kind of decision. So it makes a lot of sense to me. All right, well that sounds good. Let's chat about some of the stuff in the book here because I mean there's a lot. We surely will not get to it all, but you have a lot of interesting ideas and concepts about the different ways in which to process things. And one thing you mentioned is this idea of the standard time of the displaced,
Mhm.
and you were talking about how immigrants adjust to new surroundings and and what that means to be in a very different physical location than you were for a good part of your life. So I'm just curious to hear you kind of explain that concept and how we think about places that we leave behind.
Mhm. Well, I have I met someone who is also a woman, and she's also from Iran, but she's 20 years younger than I am, um, and came to the U.S. about 6 7 years ago. Um, and the and the first conversation I had with her, which was what I wanted to know, was, what was it like when you arrived, the
Hmm.
first week after you landed here? It was, I, uh, it was as if I wanted to know that what I knew was valid, that someone else felt the same way, and so, my God, she said exactly the same things.
Oh wow.
It was uncanny.
Hmm.
She said, I describe it as a period of being in a fog, that I felt like I was walking through fog, and it wasn't merely the question of jet lag or time difference. It was also that everything, whether it's the tapestry of sounds you hear or colors you see. I mean, people take for granted that the color of the landscape changes for so many of us. When the landscape where I my eyes were used to were mostly yellow and brown and earth tones, and you
Hmm.
come here and there's so much blue and green, and so that plus the backdrop of the sounds you hear and the look of the people um, and everything else is it just creates um, at for lack of a better word a fog through which we walk, and she told me that she was walking until until somehow um, you start to kind of get a foothold in one tiny place, whether it's something falls into place, whether you get an apartment and start to figure out where the apartment actually is and how you can walk to it from different places, or you start making some relationships with people around you, but you find a small foothold, and you begin to kind of anchor yourself to the place, and then hopefully the fog begins to lift, but none of it happens quickly, um, and maybe it shouldn't. Maybe in a way it's a it's a process of gestation too,
Hmm.
that we don't want such an important period to pass really quickly without us settling in it properly.
That must have been great to hear, that, or that, I don't know, great, but that must have been just like that the fact that other people are having your experience.
Yes.
And I think for an immigrant to read this book, and they're probably going to see a lot of things like that where they can say, oh yes, like that happened to me, and that happened to me, and this happened to me. And
Yeah.
like when you describe how people that were doctors in their country they came from are now, and they show up with all of their information and everything, and they're ready to become doctors again, and they're like, nope, you just have to go do some, you're a janitor for right now because that's the job you have, and it is what it is. And it's just so many little things like that that I can imagine that is similar for a lot of immigrants, yet
Yeah.
one that non-immigrants aren't going to be so easily aware of. And I think that's where the book kind of pulls that together in an interesting way to really
Exactly.
help clarify for both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I thought there was somehow an assumption that people knew, um, people who had not undergone this experience knew what it was like. And I think, the first thing that brought to my mind that people don't know is when Donald Trump started saying, immigrants come here and they commit crime and they rape and they, steal and rob and everything. And, not to say that immigrants don't do bad things, but I thought if anyone knew how disorienting it is to be an immigrant, especially in the first, for the first year or two, then they would realize that in order to do all sorts of other things beyond just putting one foot again, in front of the other and finding your way home and being able to say three sentences to buy whatever it is you need to buy at the grocery store is takes so much energy that you really don't have any extra to go out and do extracurricular activities.
Yeah,
So I,
you're
my
surviving.
exactly, I mean, my only intention was to try to say, here is this is what it feels like to be totally uprooted against your will, to be in a place where you know no one, where you don't speak the language, where um, you don't like the weather, you may come from a place where you haven't seen snow, and all of these things, and just to adapt to all of that takes everything and then some of what you have to give it. And therefore, if someone says that these people who are newcomers then go on to do X, Y, and Z, then you should you should think twice about whether you buy that or not. And that's all I was trying to do.
Yeah. And you've kind of touched on this a couple times now, and I want to think about it a little bit, which is the idea of language and the idea of English more specifically for those immigrants in America. And you wrote about how English can unchain someone and liberate them. But also, you talk about how in certain parts, like when people are in class or whatever, they start to take on Americanized names. And this is something, anyone that's listening will be familiar with when you see someone who has, like a very American name, but clearly like that was just made up for them or someone, or they made it up for themselves or whatever. And it's not their given name.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious to know a little bit more about the experience of learning English and how that changes who you are and your mindset and what it means to kind of be assimilated in that fashion where you feel as if you need to start changing your name to fit in.
Mhm. Um, I actually think that once you're fully assimilated and you feel that you have a somewhat of a mastery of your space and language, then you're less likely to change your name.
Mm,
I think when you change your name is when you're so insecure about your personal presentation that you think that all of these things are essential to kind of camouflage you in your environment. And once you are more comfortable with the environment, with who you are, with the society, then you realize that it's okay to have a name that people can't don't know or haven't heard. So, but I think during the first couple of weeks that I first came, and I was jet lagged, and my hours were all strangely different than everybody else. I was watching TV a lot at night by myself,
mhm,
um, and I remember one night I was trying to I was watching the news, and this is a scene I recollect in the book, um, and all I was trying to do was to not understand what the anchor was saying because I couldn't, but just know where every sentence began and ended. I couldn't hear periods.
mm,
So I was hearing, I mean, the English I was hearing was just one long string of spaghetti. And it just never, it was really frustrating not to, forget about identifying words, forget about, getting the sentences. I was just trying to do, to figure out how what I was hearing was organized, how
mhm,
the first thing was following the second thing, and I couldn't. And the only thing that made it clear to me finally that one sentence ended was when a Colgate toothpaste tube cut across the screen, and I thought, oh yes, so the last thing she said
right.
must have been the end of one line, and so it is it is that hard, you know, and it's very different from the experience of like sitting in a French class when you're in high school, or trying to do it via some app. It's very different when you are put in an environment where you're at the mercy of so many other things, and you don't have a choice to turn the language off because that's what everybody speaks, and you can't take time away from it because you want to do it at your own pace, and so on and so forth. So it was um, it was uh, incredibly difficult for me. And I remember especially because I was a I was a very um, literate teenager in Persian, so I knew what good sentences sounded like. Um, and so even in the beginning, when I started to string together a couple of English sentences, I heard myself and I knew that I didn't sound good. So I
Hmm.
stopped talking. Um, but I remember that I was truly, truly silent for about a year.
Hmm.
And then, it took about a year for me to begin to, say a few things. But other than that, I would, if I was with um, people who spoke English, for instance, if I went to college very quickly, I just sat there and listened. I was like a, vase or something. And then, slowly but surely, it began to come. And the reason it was a liberating experience to begin to speak English is because um, so many of the quality of our cultural traditions and as a result um, ways of hierarchical relationships manifest themselves in the language as well. So when um, you know so for instance, one of the gifts of the English language is that you don't have two ways of addressing the second person. A you is a you is a you is a you.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a you for somebody who's elder and to whom you're trying to pay a greater respect, and a you who's a buddy. And so the absence of those things creates an instant egalitarian relationship between you and other people in the language itself. And so that's liberating,
Yeah.
because the moment you're using that more respectful you, then, all the behavior that goes with that comes along also. Then, you kind of put your head down and you're trying to lower your voice and you're trying to be more polite and all of that. And so here you have English where there's only one second person singular whom you're addressing.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point, and I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting way of thinking about how language can be liberating and allow you more freedoms.
Yeah,
So again, this is a good perspective
yeah.
that maybe I wouldn't have had just
Mhm.
having, of course, spoken English since I could. That was it. That's all I've spoken. But I also very much identified when you were talking about watching TV and not knowing where things started or ended. That's often my experience with other languages that I don't know, and
Mhm.
I think it's interesting. Like just you tend to feel as if when, at least for me, when I'm listening to a language I don't know. I mean, there's a continuum, right? Like I understand Spanish maybe better than other languages or whatever. But if it's like truly a language I don't know, it almost like feels faster. Like it just feels like, they're accelerating, or the speed is that much faster. Although, if I, you recorded it, I would and compared, I would guess there's not that big of a difference in how many words per minute, the
Yeah,
different languages are doing. It's just more your ability to know where the periods are and to understand where the breaks are,
yeah,
and not having that is very disorienting. So
yeah. Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Um, but I wanted to ask you about, you wrote this line that I thought was telling. You wrote, "You work so you can love, and to love generously you must work a lot." And I know that we hear a lot of why immigrants are coming to America to send remittances, back home, and to for a better future for them, their children, their families. And you talk a lot. You talk in the book about the work ethic and the way in which immigrants think about work. So I'm just curious to have you expand on that sentence and that idea of work, really, because that's a big part of the book. I feel like in many different ways is trying to get a job and getting the job and then working at the job, and how immigrants view that. thing again, which just like Americans' ability to understand English, we maybe take that for granted, and just we maybe take the ability to have a job for granted as well.
Exactly. I mean, there's a beautiful book that came out in a couple of years. A good provider is one who leaves, and and it's the story of a couple of Filipino families who basically have to say goodbye to their families for decades in order to be able to fulfill their duties as parents. And I think um, we as Americans take that for granted that um, people come here because everything they love depends on how well they do here and how well they perform here. So when this is another reason that I think people should think twice when they hear that immigrants cause crime. Immigrants are, by and large, are here because they need to be here in order to work, because the families who depend on them need them to send remittances. And in order to do that properly, they become law-abiding citizens because they need to, make sure that the paycheck comes in. And so I think, so much of that logic um, is very essential in for the way we believe so much of what's being said about immigrants and immigration. Now, um, eh, I think while I'm challenging the idea that immigrants are, the cause of uh, instability or crime in our communities, I certainly dispute that in a major way. Not to say that immigrants don't do bad things, but that immigrants, for the most part, need to come here because they're providers and they're dreamers. And and in order to dream properly or provide properly, you need to act properly. And I think that's the most fundamental thing that every immigrant understands, that I need to play by the rules and do everything to the best of my ability in order to either get to my dream or send a fat check home. So either one of these two.
Yeah.
But I also think that, and maybe this is among the questions that you'll be asking, but I also think that there is somewhat of an illusion about how many immigrants or how immigrant friendly we can afford to be. Um, there is no end to the crises, whether they're environmental or other crises that are occurring or will be coming. And therefore, it doesn't matter how many we accept into our country and um, uh, how friendly we become towards immigrants and refugees. Those problems are bigger than us.
Hmm.
And so at the same time, I think while we ought to, raise quotas and be kinder and all that, at the end of the day, what needs to be done in order to address that fundamental problem, the caravans that keep coming, is to try to create remedies and come up with programs that help those people stay where they are, which is what they would prefer to do in the first place, as opposed to pick themselves up and cross several borders over in order to come to the no man's land where the future is completely uncertain.
Yeah, it's like the idea of preventative medicine being
Yeah,
cheaper than
exactly.
waiting until you're already sick.
Yes.
Yeah, I think to go back to something that you mentioned about work ethic and how people are here, immigrants are here because they need to work and they have an incentive to follow the rules. One thing that really struck me about the book was, in a lot of ways, the first part of it, first big chunk of it was, I don't know if I'd say favorable to America, but it certainly, it pointed out that, hey, people follow traffic rules here, and you can, you're likely to, you'll get, people will take care of you, and there's some positives there,
Yeah.
and you talk about how immigrants need to be here and they need to follow the rules and fit in with that, and but one thing I just really noticed as the book got closer to the end was the big flip that in my mind happened when you started talking about undocumented immigrants and their world, and to me how that, to me that world seemed, obviously vastly different,
Mhm.
and so just, be curious to hear you talk about, that part of the book and how the experience of undocumented immigrants is similar or different to, what people that enter America legally
Mhm.
experience.
Mhm. Well, I have met undocumented immigrants, and I think, like the probably the overwhelming majority of Americans, I have employed a few of them, and I have throughout the years come close to some of them, tried to help them in whatever way I could, and try to figure out if there was a way out of the sort of this hellhole of their situation. Um, but I think what's very dangerous about having communities of undocumented immigrants is that, yes, it's what's obvious is that something bad is happening to them.
Mm-hmm.
That that is clear. There are people who basically become an underclass. But I think what the rest of us are far less aware of is that we too enter in a relationship with them, that we don't realize that we are part of sort of this ecosystem where we, one way or another, are become a reason why that misery continues, and how they it recycles itself and goes on and goes on. The fact is, we need them, and we use them. The people who fed us through this year of COVID, who were the reason why we had fruits and vegetables, despite all the um, damage that had been done to our economy, is
Mm-hmm.
because we have farm workers who are, most of them are undocumented, and they kept working all through the plague. So we need them, we're using them regardless. But what happens is that they do what they're supposed to do, which is work the farms and
Mm-hmm.
ship the food to us. But we're not doing for them what we need to be doing, which is to make sure that we return the favor, that we also become responsible citizens and look after people who are looking after us. So that lessens our humanity, that lessens the quality of our humanity, and that puts us uh, in a relationship where we accept to be that way.
Mm.
And I think in the process, so many other things follow. We become, um, we become less human. We are not reciprocating, and I think, as a result, they begin to feel that, no matter how much they work and how well they do, and how much they hold up their end of the bargain, they will never become the laws will never protect them, that they will always be the lesser people. And so they have far less incentive to be good, you know, good citizens, to
Hmm.
be law-abiding individuals, because the laws aren't there to protect them. So I think that's how sort of this bad ecosystem begins to come into being, and we have to, for the sake of who we are and how we would like to be as a society, we need to solve this problem, because we don't want to be in a sort of relationship where we allow an underclass to to exist. It undermines our democracy at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. You're here.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the things at the end of the book is you kind of advocate for immigrants to not stay silent, to speak up.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask, what are some ways immigrants listening right now can speak up about that? And then also for those of us that aren't, first generation immigrants or aren't undocumented workers, how can we think about speaking up and supporting them?
Right. So, what I want for the curious, for those who are born and raised
Yeah.
here, to do is to understand that it is not an act of charity to want to for the undocumented to come in from the cold. It is an act of uh, protective humanitarianism, that in order for us to be who we are, in order for us to have selfishly the lifestyles that we like to have, we need to have a healthy democracy. And a healthy democracy requires that we not have an underclass in our society, because an underclass becomes a source of so many unpleasant things, and possibly relationships that we don't want, right?
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is that we need to advocate, as legal citizens of this country. We need to advocate for this situation to end, not for their sake, but also equally for our own sake, because it is the only way we can be who we are, and have the democracy that we care about. So that's one thing, because I think, as long as we think, oh, it's a good thing to do, it's an act of charity, it's a humanitarian gesture. Yes, it is all those things, perhaps, but most importantly, it is a way to fix what's broken about the democracy that we have. So that's one thing. And I think, how immigrants can speak up is, oftentimes we kind of lock ourselves into this position that we need to prove ourselves and be grateful and be grateful. Yes, we can do all that, but we also have to remind the curious, who are the native born Americans here,
Hmm.
that uh, all those small things, mm, which they cannot see because they have always been there in their lives, are not there because they're part of the decor of this country, that they are the great accomplishments that have come to them through, a grand design by some imperfect but brilliant founding fathers, that the traffic rules here in this country work because there is a democracy,
Mm.
and because we fundamentally believe that, however flawed, the laws basically are here for our good. Whereas if you lived in an undemocratic society, the traffic rules wouldn't work, because the citizens that are supposed to abide by them wouldn't believe in them to begin with.
Mm.
So, they break them all the time. I lived in a place where no one respected traffic rules. So all these small things that we, as US citizens do not even see, because they're always there, are not there because, they're in the air. They're
Right.
there for really important reasons. And if we want to protect those little miracles, and if we want this democracy to go on surviving and becoming better, then we need to recognize them, because democracy isn't just about elections. It's about so much more. And as long as we don't see those small miracles, we can't uphold the democracy, because we think it comes only once every 4 years, when we have to show up at the polls, and that's really not enough.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to appreciate everything else that goes into it. Um, because there are other people who are, paying attention and focusing and at all these other times. And, there's a lot of different complexities at play when it comes to the different kind of power brokers and people that are paying attention and jockeying for position and all that. And so, yeah, that everybody listening also needs to step up and become a part of that to plug into the sort of democratic current, I guess, that is flowing
Mm,
by.
yeah. Mhm.
Well, I think that's about as good as a place as any to end.
Yes.
So let's do a quick thunder round, as I like to do, and then we'll call it a day. Okay.
Yep. Mhm.
Okay. So what is your favorite food and or drink?
Mm. I love Japanese food. Don't
Oh,
ask me why.
okay.
I love sushi. I love the odd rolls that various restaurants come up
Yeah,
with.
the crazy ones.
The crazy ones. I
Nice.
love them. I think there is no equal for their cuisine. And what else did you ask?
Oh, I said food and or drink. So if you have a
Oh,
drink you enjoy,
I'm not a drinker. It's a major disappointment to
it
people who
could be a
invite me to parties.
non-alcoholic drink. It could be. I
Yeah.
mean, I've had people
Oh,
tell me coffee, tea,
oh.
anything you want.
I'm a habitual tea drinker. It's what I do all day long. And,
Do you white, green? Do you have a favorite?
I do Persian black tea
Okay, that sounds
all the
strong.
time. Yeah, it is strong. And whenever I go to my dentist, he reminds me that I should lessen the amount of tea I drink because
Yeah,
my
yeah.
teeth are stained. But it's everybody has a vice, and that's mine.
I think among the list of vices, that's quite far down. So I think you're doing all right.
Good.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would
Yeah.
it be and why?
If I could wave a magic wand, I probably at this. Mm, mm, if I could go back to um, the initial years that I came to the U.S., I would probably do my very best to be kinder to my parents. And I think I was so quick to run away
Hmm.
after we had arrived that I didn't recognize um, the amount of difficulty that they were undergoing, and that I would have brought them to a community of their peers. So I don't know, maybe that's not exactly the magic wand because I can't go back in time, but it's one of the great regrets that I have.
Well, I think you can. It's a magic wand, and that
Yeah.
enables you to do pretty much anything.
Yes.
So that's a fair answer.
Yeah.
Um, well, the book again, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. Everyone listening is in one of those two categories, and I think both will enjoy the book very much. Roya Hakakian, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too. You're a great reader.
Thanks. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.